I'm Bryce Futch,
I'm Spencer Amaral.
and this is The Way Forward. Welcome to episode 5 of the Way Forward podcast. I'm Bryce Futch here with Spencer Amaral again, and today we are going to be diving deeper into the institution of the family. This is going to be a great episode to win us a bunch of friends all over the place. I mean, people are just going to be lining up to shake our hands and saying, thank you so much for all of you, all that you do and all that you say.
It's a good goal. Let's shoot for it.
It is. Today's episode will absolutely be controversial in a number of ways. And so we want to preface this by saying we hold to a biblical ethic. And because we hold to a biblical ethic, we cannot compromise on what Scripture is clear on. And we cannot compromise on what truth is. But we can say these things in love. And we can say these things with mutual respect. I know I have a number of friends that will disagree with me on what we say. I know I have some family that will disagree with me on what we're going to say today. And so I want to, again, preface this with, we do not think less of anyone who disagrees with us. We do not think less of anyone who practices different things than we do. But we will have an honest disagreement, and we won't compromise on what we believe is correct. So that being said, let's jump into the fun stuff. We're going to talk about the family. What is it? Why does it exist? Why is it good for society? Why is it the building block for society? So Spencer, why don't you kick us off and talk through what is a family?
Yeah. Well, first I want to echo what you said. We are bound to speak about this, seeking truth, but speaking in love. Mm-hmm. And we're bound to treat others with love.
Absolutely.
And that goes back to the whole, the common thread throughout all of these discussions we're having around human flourishing. Mm-hmm. We ought to be motivated by a heart to see the well-being and the maximal flourishing of our fellow citizens and neighbors. Mm-hmm. If that's not our motivation and intent, we're not acting in love, and we're failing in our biblical mandate. So the family has, historically speaking, always been considered the building block of civilization. If we take that natural law bottom up approach again, like we've been doing, it practically is where life comes from. It takes a man and a woman, and a pairing, 1 and 1, and you get the renewal of the species. Mm-hmm. That's not been lost on mankind as civilization developed. And so across civilizations, you always have some kind of institutionalizing of this relationship between man and woman because it creates children. And with children, you get responsibility.
Right.
Someone's going to have to take care of the screaming baby. Mm-hmm. We have to figure that out. And we have to figure out how to actually produce, not just help the baby survive, but produce another generation.
Yeah, a well-formed
capable
member of society.
Adults who can take on the baton and run forward with it. If we're acting in love as their parents, we want to produce capable children, capable adults who can manage their own lives. And if we love the country that we're building together, you want to see it grow from one generation to the next. So there's everything pointing to how important our children are, right? Who was it that said, it's all about the children? This is not very controversial, right? To say that our kids matter. Mm-hmm. And on our best days, any one of us would die for our kids. Mm-hmm. So there's a powerful connection there. It's still a very high bar to live up to, though.
It is.
And so a lot of what we're talking about is going to be reflective of the fact that this is a fallen world. None of us are perfect. Our kids aren't perfect. Mm-hmm. No adult, no parent is perfect. No one parents as well as they wish they could. And yet we're trying to figure out how to do this the best we can. Right. Because we are trying to love our kids. We love our country. We want to leave it better than we found it. Mm-hmm. We love God who created us and gave us the gift of life. We want to steward the gifts he's given us well and honor him with our witness and our life. So the family, from a biblical perspective, is just that. It's a man, it's a woman in the covenant of marriage, joined together for the cultivation of that marriage relationship and the procreation of children. Right. As the Lord said, be fruitful and multiply.
Mm-hmm. Form and fill. At the same time, I think we can also look historically and say, how have societies past that may not be Christian in nature defined marriage? We look back to the ancient Romans, the ancient Greeks, societies that held homosexual relationships, homoeroticism as the norm and as something to aspire to. And yet none of those cultures or societies defined marriage any differently than that biblical definition. It's always been one man, one woman. Now, we can look at some other cultures from the East and from the Middle East that would say, well, you can have any wife that you want or as many wives as you want, but you couldn't have any woman that you wanted. And I think that's another unique distinction, that even in cultures that changed that definition from one man and one woman, it was still exclusive, and that you couldn't have any that you wanted. And there was a separation there that, again, was primarily focused around procreation for the furtherance of society and the furtherance of that specific culture. So I think we can look at it both. Biblical worldview says this, historical worldview says this. And now let's talk about some of the things that
also biologically speaking.
Absolutely.
Just a quick point on why does monogamy tend to prevail? And it tends to prevail for the same reason that just population rates reflect a general 50-50, roughly, split between men and women. And if you're trying to build a lasting civilization based on polygamy, it's not sustainable for the same reason that, in China, we're seeing like the impact of the one-child policy.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of parents were aborting their female children, which means there's a lot more men than there are women.
Yeah.
There's not enough women to be wives for all the men. That creates a whole lot of instability and dysfunctionality among your men.
It does.
And it very much narrows, the number of men who can be married at the end of the day. So monogamy just works, and I think it reveals the hand of God once again in how he's created us. Imagine how chaotic it would be if things just like swung out of whack one year and 90% of the babies born were all girls.
Yeah.
If that was nature as we knew it in a consistent way, like maybe all the civilizations of the world would be polygamous, but it's not. And you see this roughly 50-50 split that tends towards monogamy. And I take that as the hand of God as well, guiding the creation.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the other positives of marriage other than just procreation, right?
Yeah.
So when you enter a marriage relationship, I think you start to learn a lot of lessons, both as men and as women. But the exclusiveness of it does tend to tame men, right? It gives them an outlet for their energy to whether that's sexual or otherwise, to build a life, right? To put their hands to the plow and say, I'm going to build a better life for my wife and I.
Right.
I'm going to help create stability within our household, whether that's projects around the house or working extra hours or doing what you need to do to help that family unit become cohesive and move forward, right? So if you have like in China right now, they don't have that opportunity. And so they're seeing a lot of unrest. They're seeing a lot of people that are, a lot of guys are joining the military because they're looking for these outlets for this energy to build and to form and to fill that they can't have at home.
Right. It's taking on responsibility. It's taking on accountability for other people that you're willing to accept as a liability. Like there's no greater liability than a child, right? And even taking on a spouse, you are signing up to die for this person. And that actually brings the best out of us. And when we live up to that calling, it's such a healthy thing for our soul.
Absolutely.
Ironically. And that's part of the whole paradox of us doing the uncomfortable thing and seeing God do tremendous good through it.
Right. So let's take a second and look at kind of the way the family's broken down over the years, right? So within just the last 100 years, right, Ronald Reagan kind of set the dominoes afall when he created or allowed no-fault divorce in California.
Right.
You want to talk a little bit about no-fault divorce and how that's impacted familial relationships?
Sure, a little bit. As a native Californian,
we won't hold it against you. I mean, we will, but we won't tell you.
Well, you're welcome for Ronald Reagan, okay? I'll take credit for him.
Thanks.
At least,
other than this,
there's a lot that I appreciate about him and his story.
Oh, absolutely.
But also, yeah, he's not perfect. So he's the governor who gave us no-fault divorce in California. And for anyone who has a deep devotion to the family as the building block of society, that is a death knell for civilization. I see how deeply linked it is to the whole sexual revolution.
Yes.
And the shifting of moral norms and culture. It deeply reflects. I remember being, libertarian kid arguing with a professor at one point about how no-fault divorce is a good reflection of, the law of, or the principle of consent applied to marriage. And that made a lot of sense to me at that time. I think it makes a lot of sense to people today that view marriage as merely a contract that I volunteered into. I should be able to retain the agency to volunteer out of it as well. Especially like a lot of people will point out the irrationality of the marriage contract, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm swearing away my whole life on this one day to this one person.
Right.
And I can never get out of it? That's crazy.
It pushes against the rugged individualism that we as Americans like to have.
Totally. It pushes against, self-ownership and mastery and self-determination, all those things that we talk a lot about and value. So if you're only going for, the sovereignty of the individual, radical individualism, marriage makes no sense.
Right.
And that's another paradox, right?
Yes.
God has called us to this thing that is actually pretty difficult and hard to live up to.
That's for our good.
That is objectively good. You just look at the impact it has on civilization and people. And, it requires us to be able to make commitments to one another, to fulfill that commitment, take on responsibility, make sacrifices, truly love.
I think that's a big one today, right? Is we, especially in our Western culture, we've idolized emotion. Right. And so we're all about falling in love with someone. And I had a Bible professor in college who used to say, you don't fall in love, you fall in holes. And I think that's absolutely correct, right? Like the person that you marry today will be drastically different 6 months from now, a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And if you're reliant on that emotional connection, right? And it goes back to C.S. Lewis's Four Loves, right? Their historic understanding of love is been pigeonholed by the English language, and we have we use one word when we mean four different words, right?
Yeah,
and it's
the Greeks, the Hebrews, the Romans. They had so many different words for love, plus the near infinite compound variations on the words. So
right.
We are kind of pigeonholed today, and it hurts us. But at the end of the day, we're really talking about the capacity of an individual to actually commit to another person, bring children into the world through that union, and commit to those children as well.
Right.
And to the extent that modern Americans struggle to commit. Now, it's true, like, you got to be selective what
Sure.
and who you commit to.
Absolutely.
And so a lot of people just point out how difficult it is dating today. And we don't exactly value raising our sons and daughters, shaping them and telling them from the day they were born, I'm raising you to be a good husband to a woman. I'm raising you to be a good wife to a good man. I think once upon a time that was the norm. Parents would talk to their kids that way. These are the stories I hear from my parents and grandparents. And I also know that there was like that sexual revolution era was very much a retaliation against that. And New Age parenting totally rejected that idea of, pigeonholing your child and telling them your purpose in this life is to become a father or a mother or a wife or husband. But rather, you can do whatever you want to do. And you know what? You don't have to be shaped by this future vocation, training yourself to some other person. So it's the radical individualism.
Absolutely.
Self-determination. But when we lose that vision of what we're trying to qualify our sons and daughters for, which should also be like a vision of their flourishing.
Right.
Well, is it a really surprise that we're not producing a bunch of people who are ready to go, jumping into lifelong, stable, healthy, sustainable, committed relationships with one another? No. Like that doesn't happen by default at all.
Yeah.
So to the extent we don't have the building blocks for sustainable, committed relationships, you don't have the committed relationships, and you're still going to have a whole lot of people producing kids.
Right.
That's going to keep happening. Who's going to raise these kids, and how are they going to be shaped by the presence or absence of functional slash dysfunctional parents that are in or out of relationship with one another? All those things are so deeply impactful to kids.
Absolutely. So talking about the way those culture shifts, one of my favorite well, this is going to sound misogynistic if I say it's one of my favorites. I'll say a quote that I thoroughly enjoyed and appreciated.
You said this is going to sound what?
Misogynistic if I
I
said
thought you
this
said fascistic.
no.
Okay.
Well, in one of my favorite president is Eisenhower.
Yeah.
And there's a quote from his wife where she said, "I have one job in life, and his name is Ike." And I think it's so rare today to find couples that are that committed to each other, that say, "I am here to support you in whatever it is that you're doing, and help you every way that I can," right? And I think that leads to a lot of frustration in relationships. I think it leads to a lot of missed opportunities, because you are much stronger as a team than you are as an individual, just from a thriving perspective.
Objectively,
right?
yeah.
So, and then too, going back, I think
If you have the right teammate.
agreed.
Yeah.
And I think I would agree with I would disagree with the cultural norm that there's one person out there for you, right? If you're a Christian who loves God and is focused on Him,
The rom-com narrative?
yeah,
You reject
it's
it? What?
absolutely, thoroughly, 100%. It's trash. Throw it away and get this out of here. If you're a committed Christian that finds another committed Christian, you could. It doesn't matter what they look like, doesn't matter what personality they have, you can get along. Now, are there some people that you're going to be more naturally bent and attracted to and enjoy conversating with and more paired with? Sure. But the idea that you have that's one of the reasons why dating is so hard today, right? Is because people feel this pressure that they have to find their soulmate, and that person doesn't exist. Like, that person is created through the relationship of marriage.
That's fair. I think the whole "there's your one person out there" idea comes from probably a secular kind
Absolutely.
of trying to keep the dream alive.
Right.
It's actually trying to defend monogamy, right? It's actually
yeah.
trying to inspire people
Maybe.
to
not
look
gonna give it that much
forward to
credit.
and anticipate one lifelong
Yeah.
relationship with only one person.
I think it's trying to perpetuate adolescence and perpetuate that adolescent.
Well, I didn't say it was a good case.
Oh God. I think it's trying to perpetuate the adolescent feeling of puppy love.
I think it's a bad secular argument for a good thing.
Sure. Okay. I would agree with you on that. I give that to you. Because I like what Lewis says on this. I think he is more relevant than ever. When you go back to, so not only on the Four Loves, but on his abolition of man, men without jest, right? So
good.
yeah. So we hype. I hate to quote him, but I'm going to quote him. Andy Stanley. Andy Stanley, with all of his faults, he did a sermon series on guardrails in your life, and within that he talked about relationships.
Okay.
And he said that are you the person that the person you're looking for is looking for? And I think that's true in a lot of ways. Of we have these societal expectations now of what a good husband or a good wife looks like, but we are not acting in a way that's going to attract that person. So for example,
great life wisdom.
yeah. So for example, I think, again, this is going to sound like mansplaining, but based off what my wife tells me and what other women and I have talked about these things, they're looking for a person who is faithful to them, who's consistent with them, a person of character, a person of integrity. But what does our current dating market look like? It looks like using apps. It looks like, having sex on the third date consistently or sooner. Like, all of these things that don't breed character, all of these things that don't breed commitment, all of these things that basically practice divorce, right? Because these specifically with sexual relationships like that is supposed to be reserved for
if you've
for marriage.
broken up with 107 people
Yeah.
before you find the one.
Absolutely. And so
You're right. What are you practicing for?
Correct.
That's such a good point.
right. So there's a lot of problems there. I think we've also focused on ourselves instead of children, right? So
Yeah.
obviously, and we'll go into this a little bit more in a minute, but not every marriage relationship is going to result in kids, unfortunately. But we put the focus on me and my desires as opposed to what are children entitled to, right?
Well, you know what you're describing.
What is that?
Total consumerism.
Oh, 100%.
Consumerism in every sphere of life.
Mm-hmm.
When,
Absolutely.
When you apply consumerism to, and this is, I think, unfortunately, we talked about democracy in the previous session. There's a consumeristic aspect of democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it not necessarily, like going back to the distinction between a representative government which seeks to subject itself to a higher law
Right.
of justice, that's a natural law representative government, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
you just build in the people as another safeguard to hold your
Right.
officials accountable to this higher law. best part of the American project. A radical popular sovereignty view of radical democracy just panders to this, consumer government. Mm-hmm. And you're going to get the politicians you like the best, and there's no
it's absolutely popularity contest.
higher law than your own appetite.
Right.
And what you want and what's going to serve you the best at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. So you apply that to a family now and relationships, and you get dating apps.
Yeah.
And you get people scrolling through human beings.
Yeah.
Through piles and piles of human beings.
It's horribly objective.
I know I've got good friends that met that way. They actually got married doing that. But I think 99% of the stories that I hear from good friends and loved ones about the dating apps is just, horror story after horror story.
Right.
And I can't help but think it's largely because of the environment that is cultivated in that and the kind of people that are drawn to that, but also like the way people are formed by that experience. I don't think it brings the best out of anybody.
Agreed.
Like every environment can either bring the best out of you or the worst out of you. Certain environments really appeal to your worst nature. I would say dating apps tend in that direction.
And I think it comes from a good place. I think most of these...
You want to find love.
Right. You want to find connection. You want
It's a good thing.
It's a good desire, misapplied, misunderstood.
Well, capitalized off of by big tech.
Absolutely. Which we can blame big tech for everything.
They're monetizing your desire for love. Okay?
They absolutely are. and so is Hollywood, right? Like that's why rom-coms are so consistent. And that's why Hallmark exists as an organization and as a channel.
I'm a little more forgiving when it comes to art and literature and movies and whatnot, because like stories are worth telling and they're inspiring and they can bring the best out of us, right?
They
To
are,
the
but
extent
when you
that
tell
we're
the
inspired.
same story 7,500 times, and it's a plug and play mentality. It's not original. It's not art.
Hey, I actually
It's
like
a
Hallmark
copy.
movies. Okay,
We can't work together anymore. This was a very
to a
short-lived
point.
season
To
2.
a point.
Yeah.
I would just say, Jordan Peterson makes a point about this. There are good stories and bad stories.
Mm-hmm.
Good stories reflect something that is deeply true
Sure.
about the world and us, and bad stories reflect what we wish were true about the world and us. They reflect our ideologies, our own inventions. I think that it's somewhat encouraging to me. You look at bad movies that come out of Hollywood and they're clearly a piece of propaganda to serve a very specific agenda because this is, the new way of thinking for this niche group. They bomb at the box office. Why? Because it doesn't make a very compelling story, actually.
Right.
I think what is compelling to human beings are stories that actually resonate in a very deep way with our humanity and what we know to be true about the world.
Right.
And so to the extent that, like even the Marvel movies were incredibly successful, at least the first stretch
Sure.
in the box office, breaking every record, it's because every superhero is like an archetype of something that is good, something that's virtuous. The hero that will sacrifice himself for his friends and demonstrate what true love is and what true friendship and faithfulness is. That's all good. Like those virtues will resonate in stories. And so the rom-com that actually depicts, the guy who's rough around the edges and he finds
Maybe.
finds the girl and she brings the best out of him and they settle down and it's hokey for sure. But there's something in that story that obviously resonates with people.
Sure.
And I would just point to the story that resonates with people, I think, is pointing to the thumbprint of God in some way. When it's not just feeding a base consumer desire. So I'm hopeful that good stories will come out of people's need. Like we actually want to find compelling stories that are genuinely resounding with us, and I think that whole process, interestingly enough, produces something that's true about the world.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was a little rabbit
That was a good rabbit hole. I don't know that I'm sold, but I'm willing to take a second look at this.
Okay.
Point. So let's go back to the marriage piece specifically. So I think one of the things that has driven us so no fault divorce was kind of the open door to say you can come into this cheaply, you can leave cheaply. There's nothing required of you other than your happiness and your fulfillment, your perceived fulfillment, your perceived happiness, which then led us into the sexual revolution of the 60s, which then told us that your sexual fulfillment and your sexual pleasure is the end goal of life. right?
Well, and beyond that, there's an assumption about where you find that true fulfillment. And I
Right.
think for a long time, people understood that this world is filled with suffering and darkness and pain, right? I mean, that's most of human existence.
Right.
You read history books, and that's what you get. There's a lot of brokenness in the world.
There is.
People were pretty honest about that, and they understood, like, I better find something else to put my hope in, and thus you have a natural inclination toward God and prayer. And you look at oppressed peoples around the world and throughout history, and their hearts naturally incline towards God, who is the author of all, the judge of all, and we believe is good and will actually restore justice and take up the cause of the oppressed at the end of the day. So in times of darkness and pain, it's easy to look forward to heaven as, the place where I store up my treasures, and I look
Right.
forward to final restoration. Things have gotten really good for us today. In the last 100 years, you see this incredible development of the quality of life, standards of living, people's expectations for life, and we begin to put more and more stock in finding our ultimate happiness in this world. And I think we also, throughout the 20th century, become so disillusioned with the Western story, the institutions of Western societies, the two world wars that tear Europe apart, just turn so many people off from the historic roots of these societies and that civilization. And you get existentialism as a result, and generic cynicism across the board. And so for many reasons, some perfectly understandable, you get people looking for something in this world where we can actually find joy and peace and happiness. And a lot of people think that's going to be sex. Right? That is the ticket to paradise. I'm not sure of anything on the other side of death, but it seems like sex is pretty amazing. So let's just shoot for that and give everybody more of it, and that'll make the world a better place. That's the hippie gospel.
Yes.
Right.
And that's what I think that's part of what leads to the broken dating culture that we have is we say, okay, we still think marriage is a commitment. And so we don't want to be committed to somebody forever if we don't mesh sexually. So we're going to have a bunch of that first. And then
Because for me to remain enslaved to that bond
right.
would be to deprive myself of happiness.
Yes.
It's like condemning me to hell because you're depriving me of heaven. Heaven's just over there.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, it's right around the corner. So we're gonna have a lot of sex first, then we're gonna get engaged, then we're gonna continue to do that, and then we're gonna get married. And we're going to say that this is a commitment because that's what justifies all of this previous action to make sure that I was wanting to be committed to this person forever. Oh, wait, I'm not feeling it anymore. And it's, my pleasure is gone. My joy is gone.
Right.
And so now I must have married the wrong person. And so now I'm going to go find somebody else.
Right. And this directly connects with what I was saying earlier about how the modern mind thinks, and from its perspective, it seems logical to say that marriage is crazy.
Right.
And why would any sane person do this? They wouldn't. We're all under the influence of the drug called love, right? And that makes it worthwhile because it's, it's pleasurable to me.
Right.
So long as it's pleasurable. But so long as it's not, it's like the worst scam ever perpetrated.
Yeah.
And so you have to leave people free to exercise all their options and even break off the contract. And see, we reduce it from a covenant to a contract. And we think of it from a consumer point of view.
Yeah.
And the people around us are basically like paper towels that we use up as often and as many as we need. And it produces total brokenness on every front. The individual who's gone through 3,000 relationships, you are not the same person.
No.
You are a shell of yourself after dragging your heart through that much pain and brokenness. The children that are products of these unions.
Yeah. Yeah, let's talk about kids. Let's talk about children's rights for a bit.
Yeah.
So because the Sex Act is inherently procreative, children are a natural result of this. And there's been a number of efforts from contraception to abortion to try and remove the responsibility, to disconnect kids from sex and remove that responsibility out of the equation. The church has done, I think, a good and consistent job on being pro-life in the form of anti-abortion. I think we could do a better job in the way, like, I think we all hold to a pro-life stance from birth to grave. We just don't always talk about it the right way. So
Yeah.
I think sometimes we get hit on that. But I think we really, at least the Protestant evangelical church in the U.S. has really dropped the ball on contraception, and with especially within the confines of a marriage, and why that's a harmful thing. And we can talk about that a little bit if you want, but we don't need to go into great detail there. But then when kids do come, now it's or if kids don't come, it's about us and our desire. So, we take the plunge. We finally decide to get married. We do it. We wait until we feel like it's most convenient for us to have kids. And we self-rationalize that I need to have a little more money in the bank, or I need to be at a certain part of my career. And then I can change my focus away from me into my kids. So, and we justify and say, well, if I wait, then my kids will have a better life. And that's really not true. So then we have kids, but then we say, well, if we can't have them, we'll figure it out. Well, we may not adopt, because adopting is saying, well, I think a lot of people will pursue an avenue like IVF or surrogacy or something like that, as opposed to adoption, because it's still about me. It's about me passing on my genetic makeup to the next generation.
It's me. It's the consumer impulse. I
Right.
want what I want when I want it.
Right. Without the consequences and the work that it takes to get there.
And the other, factor behind the scenes there is just the all-consuming desire for control,
Absolutely.
which rarely works out the way we want it to. Never leaves us satisfied. We never have as much control as we want, and then when we think we have control over things, we realize we don't.
Right.
So many couples, they put off having kids for a long time because we assume we control that whole thing, and we
Right.
can turn it on when we want. We can turn it off for as long as we want. And then you go to flick the switch and the lights don't come on. And you realize, like, oh, there's another hand at work that holds all of this together in ways that we can't even begin to fathom. And yet we were very comfortable thinking that we were, the masters of nature.
Yeah.
And all these processes. And it's like, no, the existence is a miracle. Life is a miracle. All of these things going on, we can never take them for granted.
Right.
All of this is so beyond us, and we think we understand it all. But of course, we don't understand it. But somebody in a room
Sure.
somewhere,
Somebody
they
does.
understand it all. We can control all this stuff.
Right.
No, let's not kid ourselves. I'm glad you brought up contraception too, and the place in which we try to separate children from sexual union and marriage. I think that is where Western civilization really died. Not that we can't resurrect it, not that there's no legacy there to be fought for. There is, but I think if you're going to talk about Western civilization, is it like struggling? Is it toppling? It's
Flourishing.
What we mean by real Western civilization, that thing died a while back, and I think it's very much coinciding with the development of contraception, and that's the immediate pivot towards the sexual revolution, because we think we can control sexuality. We begin to trust in this as the new Messiah, right? This is the ticket to heaven, our Valhalla, whatever you want to think of it as. But it's the key to happiness, and it's the centerpiece of human fulfillment. And it's like putting all of our money on that one horse. And if any lesson has been learned in the last century, it should be that horse can't hold all that weight.
Right.
And there's a whole lot of damage along the way as the horse died. But to contraception, if we separate procreation from marriage, so many things start to go wrong in your theological approach to what marriage is. How do you define marriage? What is really the difference between a heterosexual coupling and a homosexual coupling if children are not a part of the equation?
And let's differentiate here real quick. If children are not an intentional part of the equation, right? In a heterosexual couple of age,
by factor in the equation, I don't mean that they're already present, because when you get married, the children are not present.
Right. Yeah, and if you
generally speaking,
correct,
and all of this is general. And I think there's a lot of people that would say, like, oh, so a man and woman get married, they don't have kids. Does that make their marriage less valid?
Correct. Want to have kids, are trying to have kids. I think that's the difference is the
hate
intention.
that argument.
Yeah.
I find it so insensitive to the pain surrounding that whole situation. And I know way too many people in that situation. So like even talking about invalidating that
Right.
marriage is so offensive to me. Furthermore, the validation of the marriage does not come from the couple producing anything. It comes from them standing in the sight of God and man and making that covenant with one another and God. And
Right.
it is the
Absolutely.
sight of God that makes it a covenant and valid, because God formed the parameters of it and they stepped into that thing which
Right.
God had already created and called them into. But furthermore, it's the exception that proves the rule.
Right.
Okay, so the fact that we're even talking about, like, what about this one instance where a couple can't produce kids? You're talking about an exception. Exceptions don't disprove the rule. They prove the rule. And we all know this to be true, unless we're trying to carve out loopholes.
Right. Absolutely. And I think it unfortunately it's controversial to say today in 2024, but we should say it for the record. Children are entitled and have the right to a mother and a father, because, and this goes, Ryan Anderson has led the way on this. There's no such thing as parenting. There's mothering and there's fathering. There are different roles that are incredibly important.
Incredibly.
And secular studies over the last 150 years have told us repeatedly that children do markedly better in a home with a mother and a father. And that takes nothing away from the single mom or the single dad that's absolutely doing their best. But if you enter into a homosexual relationship with an intentional that is intentionally non-procreative and say, I deserve children, I want children, I am going to have children, and you pursue that, you are taking away the right of that child to have a mother or a father, depending on your situation. And it's not good for kids, and it elevates my wants, my needs, my desires above everything else.
And that's always the temptation for all of us.
Absolutely it is.
Right. For every single human being. And this goes back to what we were talking about with control earlier. I think everybody is going to be tempted to, throughout their life, in every situation, do we try to fight to control this and get what we want in whatever, manner it takes?
Yeah.
Or do we trust God? And my primary calling as a minister is to call people, trust God.
Right.
It is not the way of misery and, agony to follow God. Trust him and you will be blown away day after day, and you'll be singing songs of praise and thanksgiving in the words of Paul and every biblical writer. To follow God into what seems to us challenge and trial and hardship.
And heartache.
But then, it's the motif of resurrection, right? Jesus tells us, hey, if you want to actually save your life, you know what you have to do? You have to be willing to let it go for my sake. That doesn't mean rashly throwing your life away or devaluing human life at all. It's being willing to let go of our life in trust of God for his sake, for the sake of his gospel. When we let go of control and we trust him and we follow him in faith, we see him kill the worst parts of our nature, right? That's taking up your cross, putting the flesh to death day by day. And he resurrects your spirit day by day as we grow in the likeness of Christ. That's walking in the newness of life in Christ. And that's the abundant life that Christ said he came to give us. That's human flourishing. And it's God knows what's in our best interest. He does not desire our harm. He died for our salvation. He loves us more than we could ever comprehend. And yet it's still difficult for us to trust him.
Yeah. So let's win some more friends here, and let's dive into IVF and surrogacy and why those things are problematic, deeply problematic for a lot of people. I think 2 or 3 years ago, I almost said 2 or 3 years ago now, that they came out with the CRISPR technology, the gene editing tools. Yeah. And a lot of people were very concerned that this was opening the floodgates to designer babies, and that affluent people could pick what genetic elements they wanted their children to have, which would then give them, an upper leg in society and in life.
Is it
unfortunately,
upper hand or upper leg?
it's upper hand. You said it. Thank you for correcting me on that. That would have sounded really foolish if I had said upper
Maybe
leg.
in Florida,
Leg
you know,
up.
they
Leg
say-
up is what I was trying to get to.
Yes.
An upper leg. That would just be a thigh. Nobody needs nobody needs a thigh. Metaphors mixed all the time here. So, but we're currently seeing that happen within the IVF realm, right? So a lot of people that go down the IVF route use what you called earlier a kind of a shotgun approach, and so they try and get as many fertile eggs as they possibly can,
Yeah.
and then they back up and say, okay, which ones
Try
are
to
most,
get the odds in our favor.
right, and then the doctor comes in and says, okay, well, which ones do we want to implant? Which ones are most quote most
This one has
viable?
brown eyes. This one has blue eyes.
Yeah.
This one has green eyes. You choose.
And even if you don't go that deep into your options, even if you just say this child is more viable than this child, right? You're making a selection.
This one has a, I don't know, whatever they can tell you. They're going to be able to differentiate in
good bit.
astounding ways.
Oh,
Even
yeah.
if they tell you this one is a higher percentage of having a genetic defect.
right.
Like, oh, well,
Well, they're out.
yeah.
And if we are going to be consistent in our pro-life message, that life begins at conception, then each one of those fertilized eggs is a soul and is a life and has value, worth, and dignity. And any decision that we make to choose one over the other is incongruous and is of the highest. It's of the highest importance.
I think a lot of people struggle with that because they're like, look, this is a clump of cells. Mm-hmm. You might say this is a life, it's a soul, but come on, they're not sentient, they're not aware, they're not feeling pain, they don't know. So what's the harm? And I would say another fact that we need to remember and recognize is the damage that this does to ourselves when we put ourselves in that position to be God and play God and toy with life like this.
Absolutely.
It's a violation of conscience the minute we understand, no, this is a fertilized egg.
Right.
This is a viable human life. And now I'm making as an agent, I'm making that choice to dispense with it. There's no way that doesn't do something to your soul. It's the thing that once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Absolutely.
So Jefferson, had to deal with this in how he talked about slavery. He acknowledged the intrinsic evil of slavery. And he even went so far as to say, look, slavery is terrible for the slave. It's also terrible for the slave owner.
Yeah.
Because it does something, it's dementing to your soul.
Absolutely.
To be one who thinks that you were born with spurs and this guy was born with a saddle on his back. And it's your role to be his master. That's not good for us. It's deeply damaging to our souls. That's a very big part of this conversation as well.
Right. Absolutely. And then even a step further in relational harmony, right? So if you're a homosexual couple that says we want to have a kid and you go down that route, how do you have that conversation with each other about whose genetic material do you pass down to the next kid, right? Like whose child is this actually? And that is, obviously I don't have firsthand experience, but just even trying to imagine having that conversation with my spouse, I can't.
No easy way to do that.
You can't do it. No. And it is, so not only is it harmful to you, it's harmful to them. And on the IVF piece as well, like there's, thousands upon thousands of these snowflake babies, of these fertilized eggs that are in a deep freezer around the country that are waiting to be used or to be adopted.
Insane.
And it's horrific. There's a whole generation that's just sitting there waiting to be brought in from the cold. And it's heartbreaking, right? And so when we add to that, so say you come in as a couple and you have 5 fertilized eggs and you're trying to be consistent in your pro-life message ethos, and you say, we're going to keep all 5, but we're going to start by implanting 1. And then we're going to go down the line and over the course of the next 10, 15, however many years, we're going to take all 5. You can't control what happens to you.
Yeah.
You can't control what happens to your body. You can't control an accident you might be in. And then think about the damage that does to you and to your soul to know that you have 4 kids sitting there that you wanted to have, that you now can't. And then you say, okay, well, we're going to find a surrogate. We're going to find somebody else to carry this child for us. Well, the relationship, the body and physical relationship between the child and the mother in the womb is a deep one. It is not simply physical. It's not, the mom is not just a carrier, right?
Yeah.
And so even though there's different genetic makeup of that
It
child,
commodifies the woman's body.
it does. It commodifies a woman's body.
But you either go that direction or you create, test tubes where
Right.
we can actually see these children through to a viable life.
But then you're still cheating, unless you have an adoptive set of parents ready, you're still cheating them out of the mother and father, right? So,
Yeah.
But the baby, when it's born, doesn't go to the mother whose genetic makeup it shares. It goes to the mother that carried it, right? That's the mother that it knows. And so even then, when the surrogate mother gives up that child has now been ripped from its only home that it's known. It's ripped from the person that its body tells it to connect to, right?
Yeah.
The one whose voice it recognizes, the one whose scent it recognizes, the one whose milk it desires. And so it's there's such a deep connection that's already there that's missed. And so
It's the natural connection.
yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Anything else is deeply unnatural and it's automatically harmful to the child. And we're making the child pay the price
Correct.
for these choices that we're creating and
That's
putting
the
that
problem.
child in.
Absolutely.
It's so deeply unjust to the child. So in all of this, are we walking humbly and justly in the sight of God and stewarding the gifts he's given us and loving the people around us the best we can for their flourishing and our mutual well-being? Objectively, no. We're creating situations that seek, our good, that we want control. We want what we want. We want to satisfy our desires now. Everyone does.
Yeah.
This doesn't make you an evil person. I'm saying everybody's going to
right.
wrestle with this.
Absolutely.
And it's going to be so tempting to create institutions and systems to cater to our every desire.
Right.
And at a certain point, we have to be able to recognize, I think to Jesus being tempted by Satan in the wilderness right after his baptism. You have to be able to identify evil when it stares you in the face, and you have to be able to draw a line in the sand and say no, even when it's offering you what you want. And if we can't identify it and say no, it's our own, it's our own end. It's our own doom.
Yeah. And even though we it is absolutely true that this comes from a personal desire and a self-rationalization of, well, God wants me to be happy. God wants me to be fruitful. God wants me to help my neighbor. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to be a part of these things for them, whether that's...
We love to put things in God's mouth, huh?
We do.
God wants this for me.
We do. Yeah. God wants me to be a mother, so I'm going to do these things. Or God wants me to be a father, so I'm going to do these things.
Yeah.
Or God wants my friend to be a mother, so I'm going to help with these. I'm going to be a surrogate for them and help with these things. And it's deeply saddening when you realize that these things are not objectively true and good. But at the same time, we have to make sure that we clarify that we, as individuals, do not hold any ill will or any anger towards these people. Because I do believe it comes from a good place. It comes from a place of wanting, if you're the surrogate, it comes from a place of wanting to help. If you're the couple that's pursuing IVF, it's because you want to take your relationship to the next level and have kids and be parents. And
They want kids. That's a great desire.
Is a wonderful
and
desire.
here's the system that promises you everything you wanted.
Right.
If you just hand over enough money.
Yeah. So I don't think anybody, neither of us here, I won't speak
And how
for- I
many
won't speak for
couples
everybody
are
else.
now impoverished
Yes.
and in mountains of debt and have no kids to show for it?
Right.
After the system promises, you have a chance. Here, I want to monetize that desire that you have for a good thing, actually.
Right.
And you end up with nothing but debt on the other side.
So I won't speak for anybody else, but for the two of us, the reason why we're having these conversations is because it's important to change the way we view these things that culture tells us is good, that is objectively not good. But at the same time, we have deep love and affection and for people who have gone through these things.
Yes.
And who want the right and who are trying to pursue the good, but just don't understand where they're wrong. I think a lot of people just don't think through the consequences of these actions.
Right.
And so they don't see it as an inherently bad thing because they haven't looked under the cover. They haven't looked under the hood. So I just wanted to re-clarify that because I think sometimes
Because law is a teacher, like
Yeah.
you said earlier.
absolutely.
We see what we want, and we see that the world is willing to give us what we want,
Right.
and society and culture has its norms, and it will smile upon us doing these
Yes.
things. So we're definitely not getting a whole lot of good influences, generally speaking,
Correct.
from the cues of the world.
Yeah. Going back to to the marriage piece and to the breakdown of marriage, there's a consistent pattern with fatherless homes and young men who turn out to be nothing shy of monsters, unfortunately, right? So if we look at the majority of school shootings in the last 50 years,
there's a strong correlation.
There's a strong correlation between the two. And that is not to say that every kid that grows up in a single mom home is going to be a school shooter.
Right, because you go too far the other direction. It's like, well, guess we better abort them all, right?
Right.
Because they're probably going to end up killing everybody. And like, no, that's not the point.
Correct. But the point is we as a society cannot continue to turn a blind eye to these things. Going back to Lewis and Men Without Chests, he says, we laugh at honor and we're shocked to find traitors in our midst.
Yes.
Right? We castrate and we bid the geldings be fruitful.
Yes.
We hold these morally opposed positions and we don't draw a line between the two and say, well, this is just not congruent. This doesn't work. And so I think in order for us to have a strong institution of family, right, which we've stated multiple times is the core building block for society, there has to be
what else are you going to choose?
Right.
The rugged individual. Yeah, show me a radical individualist 2-month-old, right? It doesn't exist. Human beings have never existed in an individual scheme. Even when it was just Adam, he was walking in the presence of the Father.
And I think that the phrase that I just can't stand from the left is, it takes a village to raise a child, because they misapply it so deeply, right? They say, you as a parent don't need to raise your child. You can do it as a single person. You can do it in whatever context you desire that's most fulfilling to you, because your community will help you and your community will bring this child along in this utopian, just fairy pixie dust.
Child of the community.
Correct.
Is a silly
concept. It's a horrible, and it's dangerous, right? Whereas that phrase, right understood, is the village of your family and the village of your immediate community that you're connected to, such as the church or So the nuclear family also, I think, needs to be expanded, right? So for a long time, that rugged individualism in America said, well, the American dream is to retire at 50, if not sooner. Everybody wants the 4-hour work week.
Right.
Retire as soon as I can, get on the golf course, play as much golf as I can, see the world, travel,
have a beer on all the world's beaches.
Yeah. And that is a unfulfilling destination, right? There was, I think I mentioned it in our introductory session on this. There was recently I was at this Republican gathering, and we were talking about the problems that we face with a large number of retirement homes in our community, and the strain that it puts on our EMS system, and how this could be solved if I made the point, foolish me, in a Republican context, that this could be solved if the nuclear family took more responsibility for its elders, and that the elders were willing to live with their children. But I was basically scorned and basically laughed out of the room and said, no, it's the government's job to fix this. Right? Social Security needs to do a better job. Yeah. We have the distinct privilege of living with two of our family members, and it is the amount of development in our daughter is insane. And the fingerprints that they've already left on her in her life are indelible, right? And she is so much better for it, and they are getting a sincere feeling of fulfillment by pouring into her on a regular basis, right?
Talking about infusing every day with so much purpose.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Just because you're over 70, your life is not over, right? Just because you're over 70, your usefulness to society is not over. You don't need to go sit in a corner and sit by yourself and not be a bother to anybody, right?
You're absolutely right.
That's the problem with the eugenics movement, right? Is the ability to die turns into the duty to die, to not be a burden. And the fact that we allow people to even use the phraseology of being a burden on your family is foolish.
You can't even start having those conversations unless you say, look, there's life, and then there's the life that matters.
Right. The good life, right?
Right. The life worth living.
Yes.
And that which just isn't. Objectively speaking, we're going to help you make sure that you're not in that category.
Yes.
Getting you out of here. Mm-hmm. You can't even begin to have that conversation without saying, I'm going to be the one to draw that line.
Correct. Yep.
I'm comfortable having that conversation because my hands are on the wheel of power. Mm-hmm. I know that I'm in the safe group, right? And I want to make sure then I say who's in the out group.
Yeah.
This could never possibly turn against me.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of this goes back to our desire to avoid pain and our desire to avoid suffering.
Right. Let's just make it disappear.
Yeah. And we lose the idea that, 150, I keep realizing I'm older than I think I am. And so I have to go from like 30 to 50 to now it's like 150 years ago.
Yeah.
150 years ago, it was seen as a bad thing to die suddenly. Right? You missed the opportunity to say your piece with your family, to right relationships, and to come to a right place in your relationship with God as you understand Him.
That's a good point.
And you were looked on. You were looked on as pitiful. Now I can't tell you how many people I've heard tell me, "I hope I die in my sleep. Oh, I hope a stroke takes me. I hope I die from a heart attack."
Yeah.
Because it avoids all that suffering and pain. And the same thing is true when we're talking about finding these solutions to what we perceive as problems, right? Like childlessness. Well, I don't want the pain that brings, so I'm going to go with IVF. Or I don't want the pain that this over here brings, so I'm going to take this cheap solution or this quick solution. Cheap, not monetarily, but emotionally, right? It's let's find a quick, easy way out, which goes back to our consumerism, right?
Yeah. And, Bryce, maybe the main thread throughout all these conversations is there's a one of the things that ails America the most today, there's a deep intellectual dishonesty in our culture. It's the problems that we're willing to talk about and the solutions we're willing to entertain versus the bigger problems that we don't talk about.
Right.
And do we acknowledge it that some things are worse than death? Mm-hmm. Nope. We don't have a way to categorize that today with our culture. The worst evil is pain, and the greatest good is pleasure.
Yes.
And we just reduce everything to those two-dimensional wooden boxes, and it is so stupid and dishonest about the human experience.
Right.
It's ignorant of history. And it also just speaks to our ridiculous and insane privilege. Like, you want to talk about privilege?
Oh, yeah.
Only the most privileged societies can say history doesn't matter. We don't need to think about it.
Right.
We don't need to learn from the past.
Yeah.
We don't need to learn from our own mistakes. We can do what we want because we control it all.
Right.
See how long that lasts.
Yeah, absolutely. I think another thing that's really come of age is since the Obergefell decision, the pre-Obergefell, there was a lot of folks like Ryan Anderson who were saying, if we change the definition of marriage to simply be an emotional tie or a physical connection, and we separate it from the work that marriage does on society and for society, specifically through procreation, then we're going to open that door for it to be whatever it wants to be. And everybody was like, no, absolutely not. Like, just because we redefine for homosexual relationships, it's not going to, polyamory is not going to be a thing. And what have we seen? We've seen an increase in polyamorous relationships. We've seen an increase in people wanting to marry objects. That recently there was a story in the news about
marry the ocean.
Yeah, there's a man in Japan who married a computer program, and the company that serviced the computer program went out of business, and his quote wife disappeared. Like, she's gone.
They killed her.
They took her from him.
And now they must pay the price.
Right.
This sounds like a new John Wick movie.
It shows.
Hey, back to my point on stories.
Yes.
Would that be would that work as a John Wick story? No, it wouldn't.
No, it
okay,
not.
So like good stories actually require a true foundation.
I will say there's a movie from a few years ago called Her with Joaquin Phoenix.
Yeah.
Where basically the same thing happens. There's some scenes in it that I wouldn't recommend. But I think it's very interesting to see that story being played out and in a very real way in an American context. And there's some other, what I would consider dystopian elements to the movie too. But when we take marriage and make it about that, simply about an emotional tie or an emotional relationship, we miss so much of what it actually is and what it's for, and we open the door to all of these other things. So now you have people that are saying, well, I'm a minor attracted person. Well, whoa. Let's back that bus up. And at what point are we going to say, well, if it's about consent, why can't a 15-year-old consent to marry a 35-year-old, right?
Right.
And if they have that emotional connection, who are we to stand in the way? Or who is it to say that, you can't marry your sister or your daughter? Like, those things have started to come up because we've opened that door. And we've said that this, and it's not a one-to-one equation, right? We're not putting homosexuals in that same category of people. But what we're saying is when you change the definition of something, and you reject the objective portion of that definition, it's now subjective, right? And so it's whoever can make the best argument wins.
Right, and we can theorize about all this stuff all day long and have discussions about it, but I really do think at the end of the day, what is most real? Mm-hmm. And a lot of people will say it's only what I can see and what I can touch.
Right.
If I can see it under a microscope, then it's real, and I'll allow it to affect my thinking and the way I make choices in the world. And then there are those of us who say the only way you can explain the most important parts of the human experience, even begin to ask and answer those questions, is by acknowledging that there's a whole lot going on that we cannot see under a microscope.
Right.
Based on what I can see under a microscope, what was wrong with the Holocaust?
Yeah.
I can tell you how many Jews died in the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. I could tell you whether that was legal or illegal given a certain code. Mm-hmm. I can tell you what happened. I can't tell you if it's wrong or not.
Right.
We're talking about morals and standards of justice and right and wrong that we just have to acknowledge. Like, these are articles of faith.
Right.
Now, what is going to be the foundation for your articles of faith? Is it going to be something that is deeply rooted in history and in something that's, revealed, I would say, the author of creation? Many people talk about the Bible like a love story he's been writing, or a love letter he's been writing to us since the dawn of creation, right? And the story of the gospel is the unfolding of that love of the Creator for his creation. And it infuses every single one of us and every one of our days and our relationships with purpose and meaning. Every life lost in the Holocaust with purpose and meaning. And if that's the case, and we're willing to think about it through that lens, you're not locked into this really nihilistic, materialistic, consumeristic grid that the culture is trying to give us.
Right.
You can begin asking a lot better questions about what is a good human life? What is my good?
Yeah.
The way we've changed is, I think everyone would agree that we want to pursue the good life, but what do we mean by that?
Right.
And so your worldview is going to determine that. And what ends up happening, I guess, and this is where the rubber meets the road, is you meet this place, this crossroads, where you are tempted to use other people as a means to your ends.
Correct.
And without an understanding of mankind created in the image of God and having intrinsic value, and God as sovereign and the judge, and he will hold you accountable in the end. Without that conception of the cosmos and your neighbor,
right,
why would you not view other people as a means to your ends? And sure, you could say, I'm a noble atheist. I still would honor people. It's like, well, why? You don't have a reason to. We're all ants on a space rock. It's all random.
Right. I think sorry, I don't want to cut you off.
But even if you did,
Yeah.
and this goes back to the point, I appreciate the atheist who's like, well, I still would aspire to live a life that honors others and loves others. But they can't pretend to have an answer for why they do that.
Right.
I have an answer for them. It's the law of God written on their heart. They know the difference between right and wrong. But the fact that we're talking about right and wrong, we're talking about invisible things that are articles of faith for all of us. We can never cross that line to start treating people as means to our ends. The minute you do that, you start committing the things that we all bemoan when we look back in history. Oh man, slavery. What a black mark on our history in this country. Yeah, well, from my perspective, we still haven't learned the lesson because we're still debating about which lives matter and which ones don't.
Absolutely.
So we completely missed the point. Anyway, what were you going to say?
I think talking about the purpose of these things, I think there's a lot of it that comes from a good place, like we talked about earlier. And I think it also applies specifically to the current trans movement within minors, right? So parents who decide, hey, I want to have kids, we have kids, whether through natural means or IVF or whatever they decide to do. They then tie their success as parents with equipping and empowering their kids. And if their kids say, this is what I want to do, because you're ruled by the wants, you're ruled by your desires. Again, that goes back to Lewis and the Abolition of Man. If you're ruled by your gut, by your desire, then I need to help them meet that need, right?
Right.
And if we say sexual pleasure, sexual orientation, sexual gratification is the highest point of life and the whole purpose
highest
of
good.
life,
Yeah.
then why would we not do these things, right? And so you can't. I don't think. I think you can say. I think you can have a broken heart for these parents, but I don't think you can fault the parent that knows nothing else, that believes that that's the purpose of life, that then says yes, absolutely to my 6-year-old. I want my 6-year-old to be all that they can be. I want them to
be as happy as they can be.
Right. Absolutely. I want them to be happy and fulfilled. And so I'm gonna send them down this track. Right.
Either way, we don't know the future.
We don't.
So we're trusting in a certain theory of where happiness lies. And
Absolutely.
the gospel of the culture in this moment is sexual revolution rewrote the book on, happiness.
Right.
And the only thing you can really sink your teeth into is sexual pleasure.
Yeah.
That's where your happiness
Right.
is going to be, man. There's nothing better than that. That's a gospel in itself.
It is. And I think the difference between, like, I have a broken heart for the parents.
Yeah.
I have a deep anger for the people who are not the parents, who are pushing this ideology on the parents and on the kids. Because to come to a parent and say, if you love your kid enough, if you don't love your kid enough, you won't let them do this. If you love them enough, you will send them to get the gender reassignment surgery. You will put them on the puberty blockers. And if you don't do it, you don't care about your child. Yeah. That just, absolutely infuriates me, because you're taking a parent who should know what's best for their child, who's pushing back on this cultural moment and saying, this just doesn't make sense to me. This is not logical, that I can't, I have to sign a waiver for my kid to get an aspirin or an Advil at school, but we can just send them to get gender reassignment surgery. This doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, I think a lot of people might think there's a disconnect between, the idea of the cultural narrative is sexual pleasure is the ultimate good,
Right.
worth pursuing and sacrificing for. And you brought up transgenderism, and that's more of an identity issue and less of a pleasure issue.
Correct.
maybe, to some
Correct. It
people.
is. Yes. Right.
It's
It's fulfillment. It's a fulfillment.
if one follows on the heels of the other for
Right.
a reason, in the train of cultural thinking.
Right.
But so speaking to transgenderism specifically, I think what grieves me the most about parents who don't know how to handle this well, the culture is telling them the best way you can affirm your child and their value and their worth is by chopping them up.
Yeah.
There's also a deep, unhealthy dualism and Platonism kind of thing
Absolutely
going on
there
here,
is.
which this
100%.
is not new. It's very old.
Yeah.
We divorce the spiritual from the physical.
Yeah.
The
Soul and
real
body
you
are
is
separate.
somewhere floating around.
Yes.
Your body is just random matter. And I guess that is the way we look at life in general now, right? It's all random.
Absolutely.
So there's no value in your body per se. And if the real you chooses to, disfigure yourself, well, who am I to get in the way of that?
Yeah. And I think too, even as kids age, right? So maybe it's not the parent that's working with a 5 or 10-year-old that's doing this. Maybe it's the parent who's trying to save a relationship with a kid in high school or a kid who's recently graduated.
They see that as on the line.
Right.
If I don't go along with this, I'm
Yes.
saying goodbye to my child.
And they
relationship.
equate that with the wrong cultural pushback to homosexualism, which was the removal from society, the
Scapegoating,
yes,
ostracization. Yeah.
absolutely. And so nobody today would say that if you have a kid that's struggling with homosexuality, that you should throw them out of your house or cast them away or not talk to them or not invite them back for Thanksgiving. Nobody's saying that, right? You can say I think this is a larger problem stemming from us not being able to disagree well.
Right.
To say that just because I disagree with you on this, I'm not going to talk to you anymore.
Are you
is
saying that our
foolish.
pride gets in the way sometimes?
Yes. That's
Wow.
it's a shocker, I know.
It very commonly reduces simply down to that. Yeah.
So I think parents that would naturally say, again, this line of thinking does not make sense. It's brand new. There's something off here, that are now being pushed to accept and affirm when maybe they wouldn't do that naturally because they care, because they care, so they legitimately love their kids and they care so deeply about them that they want to maintain that relationship at all costs. And it ends up hurting both of them long term.
And you don't want to be ostracized by society.
Correct.
And its elites. Absolutely. Imagine if we could actually learn the lesson the history keeps screaming at us.
Yeah.
and say, you know what, I actually believe that life matters, that people matter because they're created in the image of God with care and purpose.
Right.
And that's true for all of you.
Yes.
It's, God knows every hair in your head. He knew you in
or
the
lack
womb.
thereof in my case.
He knew you in the womb. He was knitting you together. Every fiber of your being, he's holding and sustaining. Imagine if we could affirm that and have the boldness and the faith to say, this child matters in their fullness and their entirety.
Yes.
Their fingernails matter.
Yeah.
Right? The color of their eyes is a distinct part of who they're like. Okay, I don't want this to go in the wrong way. So often we don't know how to have this conversation too, because if you start like really emphasizing the physical differences,
Right.
people are afraid you start comparing and stacking and
Yeah.
contrasting. It's like,
No.
no. And one weird way in which our culture deals with that, it's like a reaction to a reaction to a reaction, is we just start saying it's the differences that make you special,
Right.
which means you've lost any unifying principle.
Correct.
It's our differences are God ordained, if you want to put it that way, and that's great. But what makes us most special is what we have in common, which is the image of God
Right.
in us, which we can't even define. Where is that? Is it
Right.
in your head? Is it in your hands?
Yeah.
Stop trying to define it. Okay, it's in you. It's the whole of you, and so people are an end in and of themselves. They're not means for our ends. Paul tells us, treat others as more important than yourself. Be willing to sacrifice for others. Love your neighbor as yourself. Scripture is replete with calls to love your neighbor.
Right.
And Jesus goes out of his way to remind you that your neighbor is not merely the person who shares your language and your ethnicity and happens to live close to you, but it's whoever is staring you in the face right now, whoever needs your help, whoever's talking to you.
Right.
Love them. So that's the challenge for us. It's never easy to do that well.
Right.
It's much easier to see people as means for our ends.
And to see him and to self-rationalize that, right? Of my ends are good for them, and so I'm going to push them in that direction. And I think we just have such a misuse of compassion today, right? That we think compassion means capitulation, and it doesn't.
Yeah.
You can have a strong, compassionate view and disagree deeply and disagree well and disagree in love. But at the same time, if you don't speak truth to somebody, then you don't really love them.
Well, I think compassion is literally suffering with someone,
Right.
right? It's grieving with those who grieve, mourn with those who mourn, being willing to share their burdens with them in love. But if you love someone and you see them hurting, you'd want to help them, right? Not leave them where they're at, but like help them be delivered from that burden
Right.
or that pain. So we need to, talk honestly about what do we think is actually going to be the answer here? What are the solutions to the world's problems? At the end of the day, the world keeps generating a lot of bad answers to these questions that generally, they're really good at capitalizing on people's pain. We're really good at monetizing that.
Right.
We're really good at making big promises and promising this new thing is going to save your soul. And at the end of the day, I think we only find peace in one place, and that's God.
Right.
And we find true deliverance in Him. And sometimes that doesn't look the way we wish it looked.
Right.
And yet we still trust Him because we understand that this life is not the end.
Correct.
And that's where, like, the difference that our hope in the resurrection makes. It makes all the difference. For those who can trust God and live into our hope of the resurrection, that will see you through anything this world has to throw at you. And I would say that's the only real basis for strength, true strength in this world amidst adversity. For those who don't have the hope of the resurrection, this life is all there is, and it suddenly becomes very black and white and very much defined by its pain
Right.
and its misery. And it even sure, there's happy moments and high points, but they quickly get overshadowed by the pain and the suffering.
Absolutely.
And in that lens, it's so easy to reduce this world to its pain and suffering. And I think that's, a lot of woke politics and approaches, progressive approaches to evaluating the world and its problems. They're very much reacting to pain. It's the one thing that they're willing to grant is the most real thing.
Right.
Right. Which is, you get the oppression Olympics because, and the hierarchy from that, because we're so worried about The victim. And again, there's like a lot of Christian kind of language in this of like help the downtrodden and the oppressed. And
Right.
yes, we seek justice for them. Absolutely. But it's weird how progressivism gets there, and we stiff arm God over here, and we reduce the world to a closed box, and it's random, and we're just ants on a space rock. But we're trying to like have this utilitarian approach to salvation,
Right.
where we just maximize happiness for as many people as possible.
Yes.
Which also means like killing the old and getting rid of the unwanted young.
Yes.
It's sick and twisted.
Absolutely. A great example of that. I believe I can't remember which one it was. It was either Iceland or Greenland. And to all the Icelandic and the Greenlandiers, I apologize. One of the two of them came out on Twitter and talked about how they reached a 0% population with Down syndrome.
Yeah.
And
They
it
mission
was
accomplished.
Yeah, but it wasn't because they eliminated Down syndrome. It's because they killed all the kids that had it. Yeah. Right? And they were championing that fact that they had 0% with Down syndrome. Shameful, shameful stuff. Well,
That would be like Hitler declaring, "Hey, final solution worked.
yeah,
The Jews are all gone. It's
all gone.
Solve that problem."
yeah. It's just,
How can we be this close to the abominations of history and not learn the lesson?
Absolutely, absolutely. This has been great. This has been a very heavy episode, but I think it's been good. Again, we think these things need to be talked about more. They're not things that are talked about very often. They're often things that people don't want to talk about and reject outright. And unfortunately, we think that's a shame. We think we need to, if we do disagree, we need to disagree well. And, like we said before, we have love and respect for people who disagree with us on these things. We'd love to engage with you and come from a place of intellectual honesty and have those deep conversations. Because we think there is a good life out there. It's the abundant life that's offered in Christ.
It's in everyone's best interest.
Absolutely.
God desires the salvation of all people. Mm-hmm. He doesn't desire any be left behind, and we desire that as well. And we seek to love and bless all.
Absolutely.
There are none that we're coming at to stab in the back.
Right.
Yeah.
So thanks for listening. We'll be back in sometime in the near future with our next episode.
Look forward to it. Thanks, Bryce.
Hey, everybody, this is Bryce Futch, host and creator of the Way Forward podcast, and I wanted to take a minute and tell you about our sponsor for Season 2, Stand for Georgia Values Political Action Committee. They exist to ensure that every vote in Georgia is an informed vote, providing clear, concise, and accurate information about the issues and candidates shaping our future. They do some incredible work finding phenomenal candidates at a local level throughout North Georgia, and then also doing some work across the state as well. But you can find out more information about them at standforgeorgiavaluespac.com. We're incredibly grateful to have them as a sponsor. Like I said, not only have they sponsored Season 2, but they're going to continue to sponsor the podcast moving forward. So hopefully you'll be getting some more regular content from us. Be on the lookout for that next month. We're very excited for what is to come on the way forward. Full disclosure, I do serve as their executive director of that organization and their partnered 501c3 Stand for Georgia Values Foundation. But thanks again to Stand for Georgia Values PAC for their sponsorship. Please check out their website and be involved with them so that they can continue to support the work that we do here at The Way Forward. Thanks for listening.